I'm Richard Kemp, and I'm here in Israel's capital city, Jerusalem, at the Knesset, the nation's democratically elected parliament that includes both Jewish and Arab members. The parliament is the core of every democracy, located in its capital city. So why has one of the world's greatest democracies, Australia, recently reversed its rightful recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital? Australia denies no other country's capital city. Denial of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel undermines Israel's sovereignty as an independent nation. Undermining Israel's sovereignty is part of a larger movement to delegitimize the world's only Jewish state. It's no surprise that Iran's terrorist proxy Hamas, dedicated to Israel's destruction, applauds Australia's shameful decision.
Hello, Shalom. This is Barry Shaw, and this is The View from Israel. Australia, once considered a large, distant island of normal, strong, individual people, healthy in body and mind, culturally and intellectually detached from the insanities of America. At least that's what we thought until this year. This year, swastikas have appeared outside schools. Prestige University posted a student article demanding death to Israel, and 2 months later, the Australian government officially took the retrograde step of declaring that Israel is the only country in the world without a capital, after they officially reneged recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. This is as extreme as you can get. It created a storm, not only in Australia, but around the world. And today, on The View from Israel, I'm asking the question put to me by one of my followers: what the hell is happening in Australia? And to help me out here, I've invited Alex Ryvchin to the program. Alex, welcome to The View from Israel.
Thank you, Barry. Great to be with you.
Alex is the head of Executive Council of Australian Jewry. He's a lawyer by profession. He's a writer and speaker on international affairs, the Arab-Israel conflict, anti-Semitism. And Alex has written a couple of books, including the anti-Israel agenda inside the political war of the Jewish state, and more recently, Zionism, the concise history. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be with you, Barry. Looking forward to our chat.
I want to start with this, Alex, on a personal note. I was present in Beersheba 3 years ago at the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Beersheba with a huge group of Aussies and Kiwis who came on pilgrimage to Israel to pay a joint tribute to the fallen Anzac soldiers who fought and died in World War I campaign to liberate the Holy Land from the Turks and the Germans. And I watched there, as your then Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, talk about Beersheba and Jerusalem had become part of the Australian psyche and history. How has Australia toppled quite so badly this year after being such a solid and dependable country?
Well, Australia as a country hasn't changed a great deal. What has changed is the government of the day. And from Malcolm Turnbull, who was a great friend of the Jewish community, who was the federal member in the city of Wentworth, where I live in, most of the Jewish community in Sydney lives, to Scott Morrison, who deposed him as Prime Minister. He was also extremely pro-Israel. But that kind of ended with the election of Anthony Albanese earlier this year. The change is one not of society, but of governments. And when you went from consistent liberal conservative governments who had a natural kinship and ideological support for Israel, the Jewish community, and Zionism, to the government we have now, we've seen the changes that we've seen. Scott Morrison in 2018 recognized Jerusalem, at least West Jerusalem, as the capital of Israel. He vowed to combat anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in every forum, particularly the United Nations. He was true to his word. But this current Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, despite making explicit assurances to the Jewish community that he would consult with us before even contemplating these foreign policy changes, has not done that. And he has changed the designation of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel to effectively recognizing no capital, as you said in your introduction, Barry. And it's a sad state of affairs now. We've been misled by this government. We feel badly let down by this government. But we know we still have the support of the majority of Australians who abhor Islamic terrorism and violence, who stand in solidarity with Israel as a liberal democracy. And we will work with this government and successive governments to correct this terrible injustice.
Well, it seems that the main instigator of this autonomy is your new foreign minister, a woman called Penny Wong, who I will be referring to Penny Wrong, as we say, penny wrong, pound foolish. But she was described by a so-called Australian foreign policy expert, I would call a non-expert, called Alex Ryvchin, which described her as the best prepared foreign minister Australia had ever had. And if suddenly announcing or renouncing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel is a brilliant foreign policy move, I don't know what makes a bad one. What made her, do you think, make this extraordinary move at this time? Certainly at a time when there's rising anti-Semitism, which we'll get to in Australia.
So Penny Wong, as the foreign minister, announced this decision. It clearly falls within her portfolio, but it's not correct to say she's the instigator of it. We don't quite know what process took place that ended up with this conclusion, with this outcome. We do know that Penny Wong is a highly intelligent person. I agree that she's an extremely well-prepared person. I don't believe she's emotionally or ideologically compelled by the pro-Palestinian lobby and is drawn to this decision, but she has to own the decision as the foreign minister. What we do know is that the day before the decision was announced, it was reported in The Guardian that the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade website removed paragraphs referring to West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which had been there since Scott Morrison recognized it as such in 2018. Questions were then put to Penny Wong and her government as to whether they had changed their designation of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. It was at that time that there'd been no change in the government's position. We know the next morning there was a cabinet meeting at which that decision was reversed, and we were informed by Penny Wong that Australia, as a result of that decision of cabinet, no longer recognises Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So she was a part of this decision-making process, but she wasn't the instigator, as far as I'm aware. In terms of how this came about, what are the forces that led to it, who did instigate this, we know that there are those within the Labour Party that are deeply opposed to the Jewish community in this country, that are hostile to Israel, that are hostile to Zionism, that have made speeches, for example, attacking the Jewish community for advancing the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, for having the gall to educate the public about what is and what isn't anti-Semitism. We've had some fanatical anti-Israel speeches made in the parliament by certain fringe players in the Labour Party. They were out of government for 9 years and they're in government now. And it's inevitable that those forces will try and use their new position of ascendancy to ram through the policy changes they want to see. And one of those is a more pro-Palestinian posture of this government. I think they're the ones that led this. There are also people outside the Parliamentary Labour Party, people like Bob Carr, former foreign minister, Gareth Evans, another former foreign minister, who also called for this move. So I think it was a kind of coalition of people within the party, within the parliament, and those outside it. Also interest groups outside who have lobbied for this for a long time. But ultimately the decision was taken by the foreign minister and the prime minister, and they must bear responsibility for it.
I just want to emphasize a few things which explain, I think, in fairly simple and geographic terms, the inordinacy of this move by Penny Wong. If you consider Jerusalem not being part of Israel, what you have done is you have basically removed things like, for instance, the Israeli Knesset, which is our parliament, which is part in our capital, the Temple Mount, which has been part of Judaism for 3,000 years, the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives Jewish cemetery, the city of David with its rich archaeological evidence of Jewish presence there for 3,000 years, even the Hebrew University, which was established decades before the creation of the State of Israel. These now, according to your government, are no longer part of an Israel's capital. What do you see any way that this government of yours will recant on this, of realizing that it's a step too far and go back and take another step? Or do you think this is going to be on their box as long as this government exists?
They won't recant, I'm sure of that, even though we will call for it because it's the right thing to do, and they should recant, they should reconsider. They should have a proper consultation period with affected parties like us before making any such decision, but I'm sure they won't do that. In terms of whether they do now consider Jerusalem to not be Israeli territory, they haven't quite said that, although I see your point. That is in effect what they've done here. Whether that was the intent or not. But they would say that whatever happens to Jerusalem is a final status issue, borders are a final status issue. Quite ironically, this government has also intimated they want to recognize unilaterally, prematurely, a Palestinian state. That surely is a final status issue, the most final status of all final status issues. Yet they have no problems exploring that, passing resolutions and conferences in support of that. And yet Jerusalem, and West Jerusalem, mind you, we're not even talking about the Temple Mount, the Kotel, the Islamic Quarter, the Armenian Quarter, we're not even talking about the contested, controversial parts of the city. We're talking about West Jerusalem, which the parties have recognized in every previous negotiation is and will remain sovereign Israeli territory. It's uncontroversial, it's uncontested. So this is really not about describing territory in a certain way, about final status issues, about trying to advance the peace process. It's not about that. It's about the government defining itself as being pro-Palestinian with everything that comes with it. They want to appeal to progressive forces. They want to satisfy those within their party and in broader society who have a natural hostility towards the Jewish community, the organized Jewish community, and the state of Israel. It's about shifting the course of Australian foreign policy towards more of a, I would say, a Corbynite outlook. There are those within the party who are opposed to that sort of an attitude, and those who support it. And here, sadly, at the expense of our community in the state of Israel and the Jewish people worldwide, those negative forces, those extremist forces have prevailed.
Has a point not been made over there that Australia is the only country outside of Islamist regimes not to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of the Jewish state? And the other point I'd like to make is that if we may take the point of Penny Wong's situation that Jerusalem is a final status issue that should be resolved in any peace agreement, what happens, as the point that we make over here quite regularly, is if or when, and it's quite likely when, that Hamas, in fact, usurps power of the Palestinian Authority and then continues with its ultimate resolve of having a Palestinian state from the river to the sea. What would be Penny Wong and the Australian government's point at that time, once they have now renounced Jerusalem or having any connection as being the capital of the state of Israel?
My opinion is that they haven't thought these things through. They haven't turned their mind to them. They don't contemplate Hamas in this sort of decision making. They don't seek to pander to Hamas. Hamas is not on their horizon whatsoever. As I said, what their intent here is to depict themselves as being pro-Palestinian, as being in solidarity with the Palestinian people, whatever that means. In terms of what that means in terms of what that means for actual policy making and outcomes and the peace process, I think is beyond their reckoning. They want to establish themselves as progressive, as repudiating the decisions and the support of the previous government, and that's it. I think that's the extent of their thinking on this.
Well, I want to emphasize this point by making a couple of very quick points. It may not be known there in Australia but quite frankly, it's known here. And this is why you're seeing almost like daily actions over here. Hamas controls the Palestinian street. Hamas is not simply in control of the Gaza Strip. Hamas is in control of places like Shechem, Jenin, Tulkarem. All these are the towns that are supposed to be controlled both civil and security means by the Palestinian Authority. But Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority have become so corrupt, so weak, in taking the money of foreign governments, including Australia, and not handing it over to the prosperity of their own people, that Hamas controls the Palestinian Authority street. So that I come back on the point again, is what happens to a situation where Australia has renounced Israel's right to a capital anywhere, basically, at a time when the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority falls in the hands of an organization like Hamas, who has one aim for Palestine, and that is a state from the river to the sea. And as far as Australia is concerned, we have no capital, and therefore, if we have no legitimate claim on Jerusalem or capital, then what follows naturally, and somebody has to give this message to Penny wrong, is that Israel then has no legitimacy anywhere in what is known here as the State of Israel, but known in the Palestinian circles as Palestine.
Well, the government would deny that. They would say that they recognize Israel with great pride and comfort and without hesitation. They would talk about the fact that Doc Everett, the Foreign Minister of Australia, in 1948, when there was a Labor government in place, was one of the chief architects of the partition plan. They would talk about long-standing bipartisan support for Israel, Labour's support for Israel under prime ministers like Julia Gillard. So they wouldn't dispute Israel's legitimacy. They would say that Jerusalem itself is a final status issue and should not be preempted prior to a final outcome to the conflict, the settlement of the conflict. But your point about Hamas, I think, is less relevant to Jerusalem and more relevant to the question of recognition of a Palestinian state, which I think might be next on the government's agenda. And we put this to the government before. When you seek to recognize a Palestinian state, what are you recognizing? At best, the Palestinians are split between Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza. And at worst, and I think in reality, it's what you've depicted there, Barry, which is a Hamas which is ascendant, which has insinuated itself far deeper in the West Bank than those in the West would like to recognize. That is, in effect, the government that they would be recognizing as the legitimate leaders of a Palestinian state. So the point about Hamas is well made, and I think it's relevant more so to the question of recognition, which, as I said, I think is going to be the next step this government takes in order to assert itself as being truly pro-Palestinian in its assessment.
Well, I just end up on this section, on this note, what I'm pointing out to you here, Alex, is a position clearly known by strategic and security experts here in Israel, not to the man in the street, the security experts and the strategic experts and the intelligent people over here. That might be detached by the fantasies that's going on in the Australian government, but this is facts on the ground over here. And we have to live or die by reality, not by fantasies. But the point I want to ask you now is, so how is this being challenged effectively, if at all, by Jewish organizations or other bodies in Australia? How is it being countered? And if those measures and actions that you and others are taking are in any way effective?
Well, the response of the Jewish community to this announcement was extremely unified. It was swift, although delayed somewhat by the timing of the announcement, which came on Simchat Torah, which the government would say was an honest mistake. I would think it was more malicious than that. But nonetheless, when we were able to respond publicly, we did so with great force. We called out the government for their dishonesty, for misleading the Jewish community, and for the abhorrent decision that they took. They've been roundly criticized by the coalition, the opposition to the government, and many commentators and public analysts have also opposed the move on numerous grounds. There have been many good editorials, articles written in newspapers, But ultimately, the government feels they can make this decision and move on. They know there's been a storm surrounding them. They know they've copped a backlash, but they think they can move on to other decisions, and this will be lost in the news cycle. We won't forget this. We certainly won't forget this. This is Jerusalem. It's sacred to the Jewish people, and we've at least sent a signal to this government how much Jerusalem means to the Jews.
I think one of the things that both Australian Jewish organisations, even Christian organisations, because I want to tell you, some of our most avid supporters are Christian population. I think they're in Australia, also together with the Israeli government and other organisations throughout the world, ought to turn this into a global issue. But this doesn't come standing on its own 2 feet. In my opinion, this comes as a result of, or part of, the rising anti-Semitism that's been going on in Australia for some time. Some statistics that I have here, Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, that the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies reported 490 anti-Semitic incidents in 2021, which they said was a rise of 38% on 2020. And there was a report in May 2020 in the Australian newspaper headlined, "Labor not trusted to thwart the rise of left anti-Semitism." It says that many progressive parties in Western democracies have fallen victim to anti-Israel agitators. Australian Labor seems to be heading down that slippery slope. So what can you tell us and my viewers about the connection between the rising anti-Semitism and this step taken by the Australian Labor government?
So the rising anti-Semitism in Australia comes from numerous sources, as it does all over the world. The far left anti-Semitism we see predominantly on the university campus, which has made life, frankly, hell for many Jewish students who proudly identify as Jewish. But it also comes, of course, from the far right. We see swastika daubings, we see increasing organization of far-right neo-Nazi groups in this country. There's the perennial Islamist threat as well. So anti-Semitism is a complex beast, as we know, and it presents itself in multiple forms. To what extent that influenced or coalesces with this decision of government, I think certainly when you talk about left-wing anti-Semitism, that would influence some in the Labor Party and therefore influence this decision. So that stream of leftist thinking that depicts Israel as being colonialist, as being an apartheid state, as being guilty of ethnic cleansing and genocide and all ills of the world that one can possibly conceive, there are those who hold that kind of leftist worldview, hard left worldview, that Corbynite worldview within the Parliamentary Labor Party, which are drawn to hate Israel because of that propaganda and therefore push for these sorts of decisions. So anti-Semitism is more complex and diverse than simply the far left, but certainly that leftist stream of anti-Semitism has been a play in this decision-making, I'm sure.
Yes, I know that, and there's always this reaction when I talk about the anti-Semitism of the left and other places, is to immediately put up front white supremacists and neo-Nazis, and it's true there are that over there. But even if I take Australia as an example, I understand there was a larger demonstration organized by a Muslim Islamist organization in Western Sydney, where we heard cries of Khaybar, Khaybar al-Yahud.
خيبر خيبر يا يهود خيبر خيبر يا يهود جيش محمد سوف يعود جيش محمد سوف يعود. As long as Quran is our heart, Palestine is our heart, Al-Aqsa in our heart, no one in the world can take it. Wallahi, 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 not your kids, not your grandkids, inshallah you, soon, you will see the end of this evil, illegal occupier in Palestine. You will celebrate it, you will laugh, you will smile, you will go there, you will hug your brothers and sisters, and the border will open. Don't lose the hope. That can happen, wallahi, within 1 week.
اللهم خذهم أخذ عزيز مقتدر اللهم ملكنا رقاب اليهود.
I understand you had personal experience with you and your family of having a swastika daubed outside a children's school. Tell us about that.
Well, what you've said there in your introduction to the question, I think is a very good summary of the state of anti-Semitism in this country. We have, as I mentioned, Islamist anti-Semitism, and we saw it surge during the last Gaza escalation in May last year, when we had the scenes that you've recounted there of a preacher standing at the steps of a mosque, calling for the necks of the Jews. That transpired. And that's a perennial constant threat to the Jewish community, the radical Islamic stream of anti-Semitism, which is strong. There's the far right, which you've alluded to in your question about the swastika daubing. And then there's the far left that we spoke about earlier. So what happened in my daughter's kindy was, it's in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. This kindergarten is owned by 3 Jewish women, and the clientele there, the families there, are almost exclusively Jewish. And one morning last week, or the week before now, the educators, the owners and parents arrived at the center in the morning to deposit their children, as they do every morning, to find a great swastika emblazoned on the outer wall of the kindergarten. And for me personally, I confront this sort of thing in my work on a daily basis. I'm perhaps desensitized to it. But for the women at the center in particular, the parents there, the women that work there, the parents of the children, to find in your sanctuary, your place where you have your children nurtured and cared for every day, desecrated in such a way, it was a ghastly thing to have occurred. And naturally, the mind starts racing as to who could have done such a thing. And you think about the simplest solution, the simplest answer, the fact that it was probably an idiot kid or an angry neighbor with a point to prove or something of that sort. But then we think about what happened in Toulouse. We think about what's happened to Jews all around the world, in our synagogues, in our shops, in our schools even. And that terror strikes you. And to have it happen in my daughter's kindy was a thoroughly unpleasant experience. But if it in some way shed light on the scourge of anti-Semitism, its continuing vehemence and the need to fight this, then perhaps a good thing came from it. But it was a wholly unpleasant experience.
Speak to me, Alex, about the couple of books that you've written. Start off with the first book about your research into the anti-Israelism and the connection to anti-Semitism.
So it's a very timely book, very relevant to what we're discussing now. It's called The Anti-Israel Agenda Inside the Political War in the Jewish State. And it looks at how the conflict has shifted from one historically, traditionally of military confrontation and then terrorism to now political warfare, which insinuates itself in the most influential forums and institutions in our society. The university campus, governments, local government, the council, to trade unions, the United Nations, the NGO sector, basically any form of prestige and influence has been infiltrated or attempts have been made by the anti-Israel movement to advance their agenda. And their agenda is nothing short of the isolation and the collapse of the national home of the Jewish people. And it's a work that I collaborated with some of the finest minds in this field, with people like Hillel Neuer, Gerald Steinberg, Colonel Richard Kemp, Michael Dixon of Stand With Us, Alan Dershowitz. And it's a book that has stood up in the years that have passed since its publication. If anything, it's become more and more relevant as time has gone on, as this anti-Israel agenda has been revealed and become more and more insidious and damaging. My second book came out in 2019. It's called Zionism, The Concise History. And it tells the narrative story, the narrative history of the Zionist movement. And it had occurred to me that there are many good narrative histories written about the story of Israel, about the story of the Jewish people, but none telling the story of Zionism in such a way. And the story of Zionism, of course, straddles both Jewish history and Israeli history, but it deserves a telling of its own. And so my book begins with the origins of Jewish civilization and peoplehood thousands of years ago in the land in which you sit now, Barry. And it looks at our exile, our travails in the diaspora, and the formation of this movement, this revolutionary movement that gathered in and exiled, scattered, beleaguered people, reformed them into a single nation, re-established their ancient languages that had been extinct virtually for a long time, and restored them to the lands from which they'd been exiled. An extraordinary feat of human history. And then it concludes by looking at anti-Zionism, which is persistent. And so in its totality, it tells a story of Zionism, anti-Zionism, and of the Jewish people.
I think that book, Zionism, the contemporary version, is a book of its time. Where can people get the book from, Alex?
So they can go to my website, alexryvchin.com, for all of my books and writings and interviews as well. But it's available on Amazon and good bookstores, Steinmatsky in Israel, Stocks, The Anti-Israel Agenda, I think Zionism as well, Barnes & Noble in the US. But if you Google online, you'll see many retailers around the world that sell it in all forms.
I'll give you an idea of taking your authoring of books one step further, and that is look at Zionism, Israel today and going forward. If you don't write it, I will, but I'm talking about Israel as being the only truly progressive nation in the whole of the Middle East, not just because of our startup nation, but really, and this is a point that's rarely made, by the morality of Israel. The Israelis are treating everybody as equal citizens within our own country and what we contribute to the wider region and to a greater world. I think that's a book that's waiting to be written. Alex, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on The View from Israel. You've explained the perception of what's going on in Australia from an Australian background. We outside are looking for sort of direction on how we can help your cause more effectively, because this position of your government cannot stand. But quite frankly, they're falling into the hands of Hamas. And it wasn't by accident that Hamas was one of the first organizations to congratulate your government on the step that it took. And that is the danger going forward. I want to thank you, as I said, Alex. Keep up the good fight. We're here to help in any way we can. And certainly here in Israel, we ought to be far more effective as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barry. And you keep up your great work. Thank you for shining a light on these injustices. You do a fantastic job. You're a treasure. Keep up the great work, Barry.
And viewers, please, I ask you to not only watch this video, but share it with us and have people realize the battle we're in when it comes to a country like Australia. This is Barry Shaw, The View from Israel. Thank you very much.